Welcome to part 3 on our video related to other 20th century movements in art. In this segment, we're going to be looking at the movement of constructivism. This was probably one of the last and most influential modern art movements to flourish in Russia in the 20th century. It evolved just as the Bolshevik came to power in the October Revolution of 1917, and initially it acted as a lightning rod for the hopes and ideas of many of the most advanced Russian artists who supported the revolution's goals. It borrowed ideas from Cubism and Futurism, but at its heart it was really an entirely new approach to making art, one which sought to abolish traditional artistic concerns with composition and replace it with construction. Constructivism called for a careful technical analysis of modern materials, and it was hoped that this investigation would eventually yield ideas that could be put to use in mass production, serving the ends of a modern communist society. And so this is an artist, Varvara Stepanova, the results of the first 5-year plan. It was done in the 1932. It's sort of a photo montage, and we'll talk a little bit more about that term. Ultimately, the constructivism movement wasn't very successful in trying to make the transition from the artist studio to the factory. Some continued to insist on the value of abstract, analytical work and the value of art per se. These artists had a major impact on spreading constructivism throughout Europe. Others, meanwhile, pushed on to a new but short-lived disappointing phase known as productivism, in which artists worked in the industry. Russian constructivism was in its decline by the mid-1920s, partly a victim of the Bolshevik regime increasing hostility to avant-garde art, but would continue to be an inspiration for artists in the West, sustaining a movement called international constructivism, which flourished in Germany in the 1920s, and whose legacy endured into the 1950s. So I talked about the term photo montage. So obviously, if you've taken my Photo 1 class, and most of you are probably familiar with Photoshop in general, and so have you ever wondered what images, how these sort of photo montage images that you've seen before the invention of Photoshop were created? After the First World War, artists in Germany and the Soviet Union began experimenting with photo montage, the process of making a composite image by juxtaposing or mounting 2 or more photographs in order to give the illusion of a single image. A photo montage can include photographs, text, words, and even newspaper clippings, and so we see all of that in Stepanova's composition. So this is an image of Varvara Stepanova and Alexander Rodchenko in their studio in 1922. Russia had for centuries been an absolute monarchy ruled by the Tsar. Between 1905 and 1922, the country underwent tremendous change during this time, the result of 2 world wars, a civil war in 1917 through 22, and a series of uprisings that culminated into the October Revolution of 1917. The Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, the USSR, was established in 1922 under Vladimir Lenin. The young communist state was celebrated by many artists and intellectuals who saw an opportunity to end the corruption and extreme poverty that defined Russia for so long. The Russian avant-garde had experimented with new forms of art for decades in the years after the revolution. Photo montage became a favorite technique of artists Alexander Rodchenko and Varvara Stepanova. Stepanova was a talented painter, designer, as well as photographer. She defined herself as a constructivist and focused her art on serving the ideals of the Soviet Union. She was a leading member of the Russian avant-garde, and later in her career she became well known for her contributions to the magazine USSR in construction. This was a propagandist publication that focused on the industrialization of Soviet Union under the ruthless dictator Joseph Stalin, who took power after Lenin's death, and his policies, his his really harsh policies are thought to have caused suffering and the death of millions of his people. So here is that propagandist publication, USSR in Construction. It's the cover of one of their issues. The public targeted by the USSR in Construction was mostly foreign. The purpose of the magazine was to show countries such as France and Great Britain that the USSR was also a leading force in the global market and economy. By choosing to include images rather than just articles, the public would be able to see with their own eyes the accomplishments achieved under Stalin. At first, the subjects depicted were strictly industrial, but as the magazine gained recognition and readers, topics diversified and included subjects from education to sports and leisure. Soviet strategists were well aware that many European countries were witnessing the rise of a small base of devoted communists, despite general mistrust and even contempt for continental social and political elite. We'll get back to looking at Stepanova's photo montage. So as the title of her composition suggests, the photo montage is an ode to the success of the first five-year plan, an initiative started by Stalin in 1928. The plan was a list of strategic goals designed to grow the Soviet economy and accelerate its industrialization. These goals included collective farming, creating a military and artillery industry, and increasing steel production. By the end of the first five-year plan in 1933, the USSR had become a leading industrial power, though it's worth noting that the contemporary historians have found that economics from the USSR inflated results to enhance the image of the Soviet Union. In this work of art, Stepanova also used the tools of propagandists. This photo montage is an idyllic image intended to help establish through its visual evidence the great success of the plan. So, in terms of constructing her image, Stepanova's photo montage, when you look at it, everything is very carefully constructed. The artist uses only 3 types of color and tone. She alternates black and white with sepia photographs and integrates geometric planes of red to structure the composition. On the left, Stepanova has inserted public address speakers on a platform with the number 5, symbolizing the 5-year plan, along with place cards displaying the letters CCCP, the Russians' initials for the USSR. The letters are placed above the horizon, as is a portrait of Lenin, the founder of the Soviet Union. The cropped and oversized photograph of Lenin shows him speaking, his eyes turned to the left as if looking to the future. Lenin is linked to the speakers and letter place cards at the left of the wires of an electrical transmission tower. Below, a large crowd of people indicate the mass popularity of Stalin's political program and their desire to celebrate it. Red, the color of the Soviet flag, was often used by Stepanova in her photo montages. She also commonly mismatched the scale of photographic elements to create a sense of dynamism in her images. Despite the flat paper format, different elements are visually activated and can seem to pop out. Several clear artistic oppositions are visible in the results of the first 5-year plan. For example, there's a sharp contrast between the black and white photographs and the red elements, such as the electric tower, the number 5, and the triangle in the foreground. Our eyes are attracted to see these oppositions, and by the contrast between the indistinct masses and the individual portrait of Lenin, an implicit reference to the Soviet political system. As the term photomontage suggests, images are combined and manipulated to express the message the artist wants to convey. This image celebrating of the results of the first 5-year plan is the artist's interpretation of events under the strict supervision of the party's ideologies. The plan resulted in radical measures that forced farmers to give up their land and their livestock. Many people were reduced to extreme poverty, and famine became widespread. Terror, violence, and fear replaced the initial optimism about the plan. What started as a positive propaganda became little by little a means to hide disastrous economic policy from the rest of the world. It became an absolute necessity for the state to project a pristine image of its society, no matter how dire the situation became. Stepanova admits no fault or imperfection in the results of the first 5-year plan. So here she is, really pushing to idealize it. Although Stepanova worked hand in hand with the Soviet government, her work shows great personal creativity. By using vibrant color and striking images in a dynamic composition, she pioneered photomontage and revolutionized the way we now understand photography. Historical hindsight can make it difficult for these contemporary viewers to engage the overtly propagandist aspects of these images. In fact, their exaggerated euphoria can even be mistaken for irony. Nevertheless, despite our increasingly sophisticated understanding of the distinction between image and reality, Stepanova's montage are an important reminder of how an artist can blur the lines between aesthetic passion and ideology. And so here's a detail of her composition. I should have shown it earlier. Alright, so we're moving on. So our next movement is the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance brought together and developed a body of artistic talent that had not previously been seen in Black America. The artists, mostly working in New York City, received broad public support for the first time. Many artists' works were published or otherwise made available for public consumption. This broad support led to the creation of a large quantity of important, significant art. In the early 20th century, African Americans moved in great numbers to a New York neighborhood city called Harlem. This migration and subsequent infusion of talent created a deep cultural center that reached its fullest expression in painting, theater, writing, music, and photography. The movement began after World War I and reached its peak in the 1920s and early 30s, but its influence extended well into the late 20th century. The movement's general themes, which extended across the arts, included racial pride, civil rights, and the influence of slavery on modern culture. So one of the artists that we're going to be looking at associated with this movement is Jacob Lawrence. We're going to be looking at a series of paintings he did called The Migration of the Negro. There are lots of different panels. There's probably about 60 of them, and we're going to be looking at a few and talking about the work. He did these in the 1940s. In a century when painting had shifted away from narrative, Lawrence is a master storyteller. And so that's how you should really think about these individual paintings, that they're telling a story. And he's bringing to life important historical events by drawing upon his emotional responses to them. Profoundly affected by the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 30s, he was first exposed to art in an after-school program at the Utopia House, where classes were taught by Charles Austin, later his mentor at the Harlem Art Workshop. Dissatisfied with the limited curriculum in the New York public schools, Lawrence attended lectures on Black culture and exhibitions of African art at the 135th Street Public Library, which was the intellectual hub of the community. It was the Great Migration that provided him with a geographical advantage. It was Harlem, then in the midst of a cultural and intellectual outpouring known as the Harlem Renaissance, that inspired him to make art. As he once described his beloved neighborhood, all these people on the street, various colors, so much pattern, so much movement, and so much color, so much vitality, and so much energy. The textures of Harlem and the narrative dynamism of the songs, Bible stories, sermons, and tales of his neighbors' journeys to the north that he witnessed in church shaped Lawrence's approach to art making. He realized that through painting, he too could give voice to the experience of his people. When Lawrence began painting The Migration of the Negro in 1940, it was his most ambitious project to date, amplifying his earlier genre scenes and historical series on Frederick Douglass and other figures like Harriet Tubman. Broad in scope and dramatic in exposition, his depiction of African Americans moving north to find jobs, better housing, and freedom from oppression was a subject he associated with his parents, who had themselves migrated from South Carolina to Virginia and finally to New York. So a lot of these panels will have some sort of quote about what's happening. So here we see in every town, Negroes were leaving by the hundreds to go north and enter into northern industry. We will talk about not only his narrative and his storytelling conventions that he incorporates, but also his stylistic and formal qualities that he also brings to his work. But I think when you look at this, you can tell it's very flat. He uses a lot of geometric shapes. And, you know, I think he's really trying to sort of capture the essence of what this experience must have been like. This is another panel, number 11. In many places, because of the war, food had doubled in price. And again, you know, very simple backgrounds, very simple shapes. But again, he has this very lyrical movement and a really good sense of color. I think, you know, here he's using red and green complementary colors. Lawrence began to research the subject at the 135th Street Library in 1939. After many months of reading and taking notes, he made sketches for a series. Gwendolyn Knight, a painter who became his wife, helped him identify memorable scenes and assisted in gessoing the panels and writing the inscriptions that you see below. Enthralled by 14th and 15th century Italian paintings he had seen at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Lawrence used their medium, tempera, with a craftsman mastery. To keep the colors consistent, he placed the panels side by side and painted each hue onto the panels before going to the next color. Perhaps it was this approach that resulted in a sense of collective unity, even though each panel can stand on its own. Searing in their immediacy, the works show only essential imagery. Flattened, angular forms, there are lots of strong diagonals, and a contrast of light and shadow contribute to the dynamism of the images. Although Lawrence used a limited palette, he arranged the colors to form focal points to direct the viewer's attention. Some pictures are self-contained, others are more expansive. As the narrative unfolds, from image to image, the vantage point, compositions, and details change in a manner reminiscent of film. So again, you can sort of think of these when you see them together as sort of this, like, cinematography. In some panels, figures dominate, in others, the setting propels the story. The people are not individualized, rather they represent collective characteristics. However, Lawrence never lost sight of the human drama. In all of his works, the human content is paramount. So Lawrence varied his emphasis to reveal the depth of the story. Motion and anticipation are dramatically conveyed in this panel number 3, where the pyramid of people gaze beyond the picture's edge, forcefully echoes the arrangement of the flying birds. The empty space connotes an unknown future. In contrast, we have this kind of nightmarish scene depicted in panel number 51, reduces the human presence to a few silhouettes in the windows and of a burning building as an indication that the migrants did not always find a better life. Now this is the one panel that is listed in your AP College Board list of 250 works. Here we see that the majority of Southern blacks migrated to the North with optimism. However, many were disappointed to find that the North had its own brand of discrimination. The constant influx of black migrants into northern cities led to unprecedented levels of hostility on the parts of northern whites. Restrictive housing, living, and working policies abounded. The city of San Francisco sent experts to the Midwest to study the techniques and strategies of exclusion. It's crazy. Black migrants were often segregated into the most dilapidated sections of the city. forced to pay high prices for inferior housing, and they were often discriminated against in the workplace. Widespread unrest over these conditions were unleashed during the summer race riots in 1919. This panel shows a public dining space in the North. Blacks and whites are divided by a yellow barrier that zigzags through the center of the painting. The yellow dividing line is emphasized by the tilted tabletops and chairs situated against the background of the restaurant floor. The tables and chairs are placed to reinforce the diners' separation. Public acceptance for the migration of the Negro has been strong since the series was first shown, demonstrating that the continued relevance of this theme. A seminal work in the 20th century art, it was a manifestation of Lawrence's ethnic pride and his desire to reveal events that he felt should be known. And this is a quote, "It was so much a part of my life. I became conscious of things when I was 8 or 9 years old, and their consciousness remained. And this is what you see in Migrations." We do have a painting by Jacob Lawrence in our own North Carolina Museum of Art. They've done a really good job of doing these little videos related to their collection, so I'm going to play one for you now.
Richard Powell, Professor.
Sorry.
Stop 214. Richard Powell, Professor of Art and Art History, Duke University.
Harriet Tubman was an amazing woman. She had a very, very harsh and difficult life as a slave, often encountering violence at the hands of masters and mistresses. She escapes that slavery and moves north, but then takes it upon herself to come back to the South, underground, undercover, and to try to bring other enslaved men, women, and children to freedom and to the North. We see her with her arm pushed, with a gun in hand. We see her with the figure in front of her who's hesitant. We see those who follow behind her. And one can kind of deal with this literally, but Jacob Lawrence is an expressionist painter. He incorporates distortion and exaggeration to make a powerful artistic statement. So when we see these arms, these are not necessarily the arms of real people. These are the symbols of pushing forward, of propelling one who might be afraid into something that is the unknown. Freedom can be just as scary in some respects as slavery.
All right, so the next artist that we're going to be looking at is Archibald Motley. So the Harlem Renaissance not only existed in Harlem and New York, but also extended into urban cities like Chicago, which is the native city of Archibald Motley. He is probably one of the most significant yet least known 20th century artists, despite the continued broad appeal of his paintings. Many of his important portraits and cultural scenes remain in private collections, and so few museums have had an opportunity to acquire his work, and so it's not really accessible to the public. This is a self-portrait of himself that he did. This is one of my favorite paintings by him called Nightlife that he did in 1920. Motley's scenes of life in African-American communities, he often depicted his native Chicago, depicted parallel existence of this idea of labor and working and this sort of idea of leisure. His portraits are voyeuristic, but they also examine issues of race, gender, and sexuality. Motley did not shy away from folklore fantasies, directly addressing slavery as well as racism. Motley was born in New Orleans, but during the first half of the 20th century he lived and worked in predominantly the white neighborhood of Chicago's southwest side, a few miles from the city's growing black community known as Bronzeville. Motley's work examines this community, carefully constructing scenes that depict Chicago's African-American elite, but also the worlds of the recently disembarked migrants from the South and other characters commonly overlooked. Archibald J. Motley often depicted contemporary black nightlife in the city. His focus, again, was Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood, also known as the Black Belt. This area became home to more than 90% of the city's black population by the 1930s. Nightlife, one of Motley's most celebrated paintings, takes views inside one of Bronville's many night spots. Although the artist painted the picture during World War II, his figures seem to have left the world's troubles behind. Inside the club, there's nothing but exuberant, upbeat energy. You can see the dancers pulsing, jumping movements, and also some very suggestive dancing going on as well. And also this idea of the jazz movement as well is being depicted. Motley conveyed the sound of motion of jazz, and through this using composition and color. So he really wanted to communicate the essence of what it was like to be in one of these night spots, listening to this jazz music, and so he communicated that through the action and gestures of the figures, as well as the really cool color palette that he's using, the complementary colors, pink and green. And again, you definitely can tell that this is inside. You know, the lighting sort of depicted looks very artificial. He outlined the figures with simplified geometric shapes and emphasized diagonal lines, creating a sense of lively motion. Fascinated with natural and artificial light, Motley chose glowing violet-red tones to sort of depict this idea of artificial light that you would have inside a club. The subject of Nightlife gave the artist the opportunity to present, in his own words, an expression of the numerous shades and colors which exist in such great variety among African Americans in Chicago. All right, well, I'm going to end here. We will have part 4. In that segment, we'll be looking at Mexican art, in particular large mural paintings. So stay tuned.